who has euro and another one who has its own currency. And whenever something bad or terrible happens to euro, for example, it starts to appreciate a lot, which is not currently issue, but has been an issue formerly, then we can switch our trading partners. And this is almost precisely what happened when a couple of years ago euro started to appreciate and Finland in terms of export was not doing so well. Then we switched Nokia, a Finnish company, to Ericsson, and now one of our major export articles is related to telecommunication equipment, which is produced mainly in cooperation with Ericsson. Initially it was subcontracting for Nokia. And of course, not to mention other neighbors, Russia is quite rich for raw materials, and Estonian ports serve quite a lot. Russian exports transit business creates quite a huge volumes for Estonian economy, but doesn't add so much value. So Estonian ports are quite a lot exploited for serving Russian transit. As long as Ust-Luga port is not ready fully, at least, then Estonian railway and ports have quite a huge volumes to serve, and most likely it stays so even when there are some developments in Ust-Luga. It's mainly related to the fact that Baltic Sea is partially frozen during the winter season, and some ports cannot operate, but some Estonian ports have the advantage that they are mainly serviceable around the year. And of course, Estonia is extremely small. If you imagine a country like Netherlands, then the size of the country in terms of square kilometers is almost the same, around 40,000 square kilometers. But the density of people in Estonia is 10 times lower, which means that if you scale, if you want to imagine Netherlands with only 10% of its current population, then you just need to look at Estonia. So country is quite rich in terms of forests, and also agriculture matters quite a lot, but not in terms of employment. As you see, our employment is heavily biased towards services, and agriculture is, in terms of people employed, there is quite a residual. And Estonia is quite poor if you compare us with Nordic neighbors. Our average salary is around 3 times or even 4 times lower than in many areas, actually more than 3 times lower than in Scandinavia. It should also imply somewhat lower price level, which is partially also true. We grew quite a lot during the last decade, and even if you include the fall of around 15% in 2009, you can still end up with relatively impressive growth rates, and it's mainly related to the fact that initial speed of growth was quite high. So it was fueled by the credit pool, but on the other hand it also enabled a country to gain quite a lot in terms of the level of income. And if you look, for example, almost 10 years of history in terms of GDP per capita adjusted for prices, then you can see that almost 1/3 was gained during the last 10 years' time. And if you take into account last 2 decades, then our level of income has more than tripled at this time. Of course, the initial level was extremely low, but we are still ranking in the range of 2/3 of the EU average, and taking into account the fact that our neighbors are higher than average, especially Sweden and Finland, then basically there are some likelihood that the nominal convergence in terms of prices and also the real convergence in terms of level of income continues relatively rapidly, although not so quickly as it was during the times when we joined NATO and EU, which happened in 2004. And Estonia gained quite a lot in terms of credibility, but also it was the main reason rapid increase in credibility caused our credit and real estate sector to boom quite a lot, which to some extent perhaps also created imbalances in the economy, namely high wage growth, which exceeded productivity growth rates, and also to some extent all those ugly buildings built during real estate bubble in any country. Estonia was also partially related to the global financial bubble. And of course, if you look at those poorer countries in Central and Eastern Europe, then certainly there are some countries which are richer, but in principle this path has been almost similar. So first decade of 27th century was more or less successful for everybody, even including Lehman Brothers collapse and things which came after. It was a decade of rapid growth. Most likely it doesn't repeat itself anymore because the initial levels were so low, and now we have gained quite a significant level already by now. And of course, I already mentioned the credit growth rates. What is to some extent different from those early times of transition, some countries experienced moderation of credit growth rates a bit earlier than the global bust started. So even in the case of Estonia, credit growth rates started to moderate already in 2007, and this rapid deceleration which took place after the Lehman was already partially accounted into all kinds of plans like budget and other things. So we didn't expect the economy to grow so fast anymore, also due to natural reasons, because indebtedness was already quite high. Also, I would say that the level of GDP has been gaining quite a lot based on the credit increase, and therefore, to some extent, our enterprises and politicians were not so overly optimistic as it was the case a couple of years earlier. So, in principle, things started to moderate also due to natural reasons, but of course Lehman Brothers and Icelandic crisis, especially for countries like Estonia, created quite a significant additional impact on this deceleration. And just some words to end up this historic overview about inflation. One of the major issues for Estonia has always been inflation rate, and it is higher than in the EU on average, and of course we also managed to fulfill Maastricht inflation criteria to some extent, partially certainly also due to the fact that the economic cycle was in a fall in 2008 and 9 especially. But of course initial levels of inflation were extremely high, and in early 90s and just after the collapse of Soviet Union, inflation rates were around 1,000% per year. So in principle, prices increased tenfold. And when we introduced our own currency in 1992, then inflation rate quite significantly fell and basically was already in a couple of years after the introduction of krone in the range of single-digit levels, as it has more or less stayed since then. Currently, of course, in the initial stages, this high inflation rate was partially caused by the fact that the Estonian price level was around 20% of the EU average, or even less. It is very difficult to compare initial levels because in Estonia there was also deficit of goods, so those price measurements were to some extent imprecise, because there might have been price tag, but not availability of good before the krone was introduced. So in principle now we have reached to the range of 75% or so, and in some groups of goods, of course, it is already higher. I will talk about the most recent developments in inflation a bit later. But in principle, this picture of convergence or price and income levels reaching each other in EU has been quite diversified to some extent, but at least a wild economist can draw some kind of linear trend there, and you can see that some countries are below the average price-wise and some are below the average. And Estonia, unfortunately, has been more successful in terms of increase in prices and less successful, a bit less successful in terms of gaining additional income. So our GDP per capita is something like perhaps 8-9 percentage points lower than our price level compared with EU average. But it comes mainly because of our neighbors who visit us very frequently and also push up prices of services, which are usually considered as non-tradables. But in a country like Estonia, where there will be something like 3 tourists per 1 Estonian, also services become tradable because of proximity. For Finnish and Swedish tourists, they can visit us and drive the beer prices and other things up, and it is also reflected in our CPI certainly. But in principle, it is not very harmful because still this discrepancy is not so high, and on the other hand, services account in our CPI basket somewhat lower share than it is in the case of Finland and Sweden. So to some extent, this inflation rate do not take into account, currently at least, a high impact of price convergence in the level of services, because typically for the small country, Estonian CPI basket is dominated by food and energy, which unfortunately have been increasing quite recently also quite a lot. And of course, one of the things which may not stay as it is, but currently it is as an advantage for Estonia, is certainly the wage level, which I already mentioned. Compared with our Nordic neighbors, our wages are quite low. Of course, we cannot compete China. It is very difficult to make any kind of comparison with China, but I would assume that the Estonian average wage is something like 3 times higher than the one of China. Of course, it depends on the area. If you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it depends on the area certainly. But the country-wise average is still quite low, and why I'm saying that it is temporary, perhaps also for Estonia. Currently, it is still one of the advantages for Estonia. Many Estonian companies are even increasing their capacity on the account of their Nordic affiliates. So basically, Swedish and Finnish companies are decreasing their production in their own country and bringing additional investments to Estonia because labor costs are low. But on the other hand, already countries like Belarus and some others, Ukraine for example, are ranking even lower in terms of labor costs. So labor-intensive production is perhaps not necessarily here to stay because of the lack of people and relatively high wage increases. But currently it plays out as an advantage for Estonia. But of course, wages are quite rapid to converge, perhaps, if there will be any upswing in the economy. And of course, when Lehman Brothers hit us, then the picture was very typical. So every single country you can name was called by the same name almost. And I would stress especially the wisdom of or the issues of Greece. But in principle, it was so that Estonia was also labeled as a country which had in 2008 its own currency. A small country with its own currency is extremely weak. Not every single economist, especially in the other side of the Atlantic, didn't figure out very well the concept of currency board, which was more or less foolproof, but still could be attacked to some extent. So therefore, I would say that late 2008 was quite difficult for Estonian banking sector, although for the advantage of Estonians, we were mainly dominated by Nordic owners, and our banking sector is still very dominated by Nordic countries. So in principle, this financial safety network or cooperation related to the financial supervision and financial stability was taking place very intensively already far before the crisis started. So Estonia was quite well protected, but still it was vulnerable to those generalizations related to all kinds of issues in possible issues in the banking sector, and also related to the fact that in Estonia most of the mortgages were denominated in euros. So in the possible event of devaluation, certainly the banking sector would have been exploding, and it was the main reason why we didn't devalue our currency. And why on earth should you devalue your currency? If you are on a currency board, you have 110% of reserve coverage for every single krone you have issued. You even by the rules of currency board, you actually had the possibility to revalue your currency 10% because you had reserves. And of course, the doctrine related to devaluations for countries like Estonia was mainly related certainly to the export competitiveness argument. So you could easily gain some short-term advantage if you would devalue your currency. But usually, countries like Estonia, where foreign trade volumes are extremely high, this devaluation wouldn't help you at all, even in the medium term. And the main reason comes from the fact that in Estonian manufacturing industry, which is the main exporter sector, labor costs account as low as something like 20 or 15% of the overall costs of industry. Which means that, of course, you could easily, by devaluing, the main thing which stays the same for some time is the salary in krones. But it's only 20 or 15% of the overall costs. And most of the other inputs related to energy even, and especially other raw materials and intermediate production are imported anyway. So it doesn't help if you devalue your currency. And in this, I would say that in the case of countries like Estonia, devaluation wouldn't have helped. The situation is quite different in the countries which dominate labor-intensive industries and also export things which are labor-intensive, perhaps to some extent. It is difficult to judge, but to some extent the story of Poland is the story when you still have a relatively high share of agriculture in the economy, and it is mainly related to domestic resources. So if you devalue your currency, you may certainly gain something. But in the countries like Estonia, you just redistribute income. So basically, some exporters will gain a minor share. Banking sector would explode, as I mentioned earlier, and certainly companies which specialize in serving domestic demand would also be harmed, because domestic demand suffers because import prices increase very significantly due to devaluation, and therefore you would easily end up so that the domestic companies serving domestic demand, like services sector and other sectors, they will suffer because purchasing power of the usual people will be lower to the same extent as the production costs of the exporters would be high. But certainly now the picture perhaps is to some extent different. Estonia is a part of the euro area, and we have just received our first bills to pay for EFSF in terms of guarantees, so we need to contribute something like 10% of our GDP to the EFSF as a warrant for financing those countries who are in trouble nowadays. The discussion in the public is certainly quite intensive, as everywhere. But in principle, at least the judgment of the Bank of Estonia is that the gain is still from euro higher than the possible cost of euro. And especially for the cases which tend to repeat itself in the sequence or in the cycle of 10 years, those times when there is a global downswing in the economy, and it happens to be almost every 10 years, then everybody starts to question about the viability of currencies of small countries. And for Estonia it has happened, I would say, that not only during Lehman Brothers but also during the Russian crisis, which was around 1998. So to some extent our current krone has survived two speculative attacks one during the Russian crisis, another during the Lehman Brothers and the Icelandic crisis, but it is not extremely certain whether possible instability created by the next possible attack 10 years from now or a bit less would have been as successful, because in principle we have seen that the contagion spreads much quicker from year to year in the global financial system, and it is not very useful to run your own currency during those times. And now some words about most or more recent developments. If there is anything to ask or add, then you are welcome to do it during the presentation, as I said. So first of all, Estonia was one of those countries who in 2009 told IMF and other institutions that we are highly relying on export-led recovery, so our export growth rate during the recovery phase would be extremely high. And of course IMF and many others didn't believe us, because it was the story of every single country in the world. Everybody was relying on at least in their forecasts, almost every single country in the world was saying that we are relying on the recovery of exports, and we are most likely gaining a market share because our export is growing faster than global demand. And of course IMF was in a difficult situation, because if every single country would increase its market share, then we need to increase the universe or start exporting things to another continents or planets, which is quite difficult to arrange. And why it was more relevant for Estonia, it mainly came from the fact that we have lost market share during the last boom, and especially after 2004, when EU started for us and basically convergence towards euro and credit boom, then Estonian economy was more in a way specializing on reorienting itself to domestic demand. We started to build all those ugly houses and other things, but also to some extent due to the higher wage growth rates, we certainly lost also our competitiveness in global market. And it was partially in a way regained during the recovery phase, which we believe to be taken place, because Estonian economy still has quite a few features which are extremely successful during global recessions, and those mainly relate to the adjustment mechanisms which need to be operating if you do not have an exchange rate to play with. Those are namely wage flexibility and price flexibility. So in the case of Russian crisis and also in the case of current crisis, Estonian wages have shown quite a high flexibility also in terms of downwards flexibility. And in many areas, wages were decreased by 10% or even a bit more. So in principle, I would say that this adjustment has been taking place in many other countries, like almost in the same magnitude as in Estonia. But Estonian case is to some extent different, because Estonia belongs to those countries where the impact of labor union is almost insignificant, which means that you can almost decrease your wages overnight if you need them to be decreased. And usually people do not mind, which is quite different in case of Nordic and other sides of Europe. Why Estonians didn't mind, it's a somewhat longer story, but it is related to the fact that Estonia just introduced unemployment insurance a couple of years before Lehman's. So it was the very first time when Estonians received real money for not doing nothing. So if you were laid off, you could still preserve quite a huge fraction of your own personal previous salary for limited amount of months, but still around 6 months was more or less guaranteed for you. So usually Estonian unemployment insurance was almost zero. So unemployment benefits during the Russian crisis were in the range of 15 or 20 euros per month. So not every single day you could spend even €1, and the price level was by this time already quite high. So it was almost like from zero to prosperity to some extent, and this is why perhaps you didn't see Estonians demonstrating or showing any kind of discomfort about the high unemployment rate, which reached almost 20% in 2009. Another question is about the persistence of inflation. Inflation has been higher than in the EU. We hardly fulfilled Maastricht criteria, as many analysts would say, but there are some arguments which support the idea that inflation rate might be lower in the future. And of course, the issues of labor market, which I'm going to discuss a bit more. And lastly, but not leastly, certainly the current state of the play and also stresses the impact of deleverage in financial sector. But first and foremost, some positive remarks. I would say that the first half of this year was extremely successful for the Estonian economy. And it partially was related to the fact that export was growing faster, but also to some extent domestic demand started to recover, especially in the case of investments. We have seen some recovery in the second quarter and first quarter. And if you compare actual developments with the spring forecast of Eesti Pank, which was published something like in very late spring, I think around Midsummer Day this time. But the main reason why spring forecast missed even the first quarter doesn't come from the fact that we don't have any idea about the Estonian economy here in Bank of Estonia, but it comes from the fact that actually the GDP series were readjusted. So the statistical office made a revision in methodology, as it happens from time to time, and then even the previous year's growth rates were re-estimated, and basically in the first quarter we grew something like 9.5% year over year. In the second quarter the growth rate was something like 8.4%. So it is way higher than expected. If you compare it with our last autumn forecast, something like 12 months ago, then the difference is even higher. Estonia certainly gained quite a lot in the first half of this year due to the exports, and it is partially coming from the fact that Nordic countries in general were quite successful in terms of selling their products in world markets, and it partially comes from the fact that there is some kind of impact of postponed investments which took place in late 2000 and actually in early 2010 already. And it comes from the fact that many companies globally had been postponing after Lehman's their investments, and then they saw some kind of recovery in global demand and started to restarted their investments into the machinery and equipment and related things, and it happens to be one of the main export articles of Nordic countries and also Estonia. But as it is the case, so the correlation is quite high with Finland and Estonia and Sweden, but Estonia has also gained some market share. And I mentioned already some of the reasons, but I would say that one of the plain and simple reason comes from one company, Ericsson Estonia. Currently around 15 or in some months even 20% of our exports is related to telecommunication equipment, not only the consumer appliances but also those switchboards which are used to operate those networks, and those things sell currently quite well. And it happens to be the case that Ericsson Estonia is one of the quite significant producers of those things. So it was a kind of level shift. It doesn't have any kind of long-term impact on the further growth rates, but it happened to be the case that some company just increased their capacity. And you can also see some kind of bizarre upswing in some months in the first half of this year. I don't remember exactly, but I believe that one ship was sold, and also some perhaps there was something related to the railway equipment as well. So one of things also matter quite a lot for Estonia. Our trade balance and even our current account deficit has been changing signs sometimes because Estonia has been importing some or single airplane or something like that. Some things which are quite expensive for our small country happen to influence quite significantly our trade balance. And I believe that this time we sold one of the, or even two of the ferries which operate in the route of mainland and one of the biggest islands. So we just imported the new ones as well, but you certainly do not see import in the export figures. And we started to wonder in the Bank of Estonia, something like last year, that whether this impact is only due to the one-off factors that export growth export is increasing, and it has been increasing by the growth rate of almost 50% in some months in early this year, already higher than 50% annually. And why is it so? And there is a possibility to decompose export growth rates. And basically we have been decomposing those export growth rates to four parts. Certainly all those factors have been having a positive impact for us in the most recent times. But one of the reasons why Estonian export has been growing is plain and simple. The overall demand has been also recovering quite a lot. This is the blue bar of this series. And during the Lehman Brothers, we certainly lost because just the global demand was falling. Another reason which has been also supporting us is the fact that we mainly export to countries which, at least in EU, happen to grow faster than average. And it is partially the story of Finland and Sweden having almost the double growth rates of EU in 2010. And it is also the fact that usually Swedish and Finnish companies are not the end consumers of our export products, but sometimes those products are also, in a way, we belong to the supply chain which doesn't end in Scandinavia, but only continues in Scandinavia and ends up in many emerging markets, partially also in Asia and related countries which happen to grow quite fast. So perhaps in the current recovery episode, the greatest advantage has been the fact that we, in principle, the final destination of our exports is not always EU, and is quite often also related to countries which grow faster than EU. So partners have contributed also quite a lot, and you can see negative contributions during the Lehman Brothers episode. And product selection, not extremely high share of our growth, but partially it also comes from export growth, because product selection has contributed. Capital goods have been recovering quite well. And what is the residual is quite often called competitiveness, which you cannot explain by those factors I already mentioned, and this is the green part. So we certainly lost competitiveness due to the lack of skilled people, and also due to the high wage growth rates, and to some extent also perhaps other structural issues during the upswing of Estonian economy, especially during the credit boom. Estonia certainly lost competitiveness and market share, and currently we have been gradually regaining it. And almost 1/3 of the export growth can be to some extent explained by features of Estonian economy. I already talked quite a lot about exports, but of course, looking ahead, export doesn't have any high impact on growth anymore for two reasons. First of all, to some extent, these previous levels have already been exceeded. So if you have been falling a lot, certainly the recovery phase starts with high growth rates, as the fall has been. But another reason comes also from the fact that to some extent additional exports require additional investments, which it takes some time until they have an impact, if they take place. And another reason which can again be also relevant, especially taking into account the most recent developments, comes from the global instability. So in principle, every company in world has been in a way downsizing its plans, and it has an impact on capital products demand, at least in the medium run, if not in the long run. And this is something which certainly adds additional risks to export dynamics. But fortunately, currently, I would say that the second phase of recovery may be more related to the retail sales and investments. Mainly, altogether, domestic demand starts to matter more. And we have seen Estonian consumer being relatively conservative up to this point of time. But first and foremost, at least initial signs of recovery in terms of investments are already here, and investments usually create jobs. Jobs will create purchasing power, and then the retail sales will follow. If one looks at the confidence of economic agents, then I would say that especially if you exclude last 2 months, things were quite good. Even consumers who are usually negative, the scale is as such that if it's below the zero, it will usually, that standard scale of economic parameters, if it's below the zero, then the optimists will dominate pessimists, and the negative scale implies the opposite. Consumers in Estonia, like almost everywhere, have been overly pessimistic all the time, and we almost reached positive area a couple of months before the debt crisis hit Europe again. But in principle, consumer parameter is currently quite close to the historic average, despite the fact that the unemployment rate is still quite high. Whereas sentiment, especially in the industry and also in retail trade, was and services was reaching the levels above the average already in the first half of this year. And in case of industry, the reason is mainly related to exports and sales in foreign markets, whereas services started to recover also quite fast. And I would say that it is to some extent related to the tourism industry, but also other industries serving, for example, exporting companies have been gaining quite a lot during the first half of the year. Now currently, of course, the sentiment is gradually decreasing, but I would say that it was more than expected, given the fact that the optimism was extremely high in the first half of the year. So partially it is the matter of seasonality, partially it is the matter of the fact that when growth rates start to become reasonable again, then usually the optimism becomes also close to historic averages. I would say that at least now we haven't seen a very dramatic fall in terms of expectations, neither in the industry, not also in the services sector. So it might be the case that it is coming in the most coming months. But even sectors which usually operate as good proxies for leading indicators, like transportation sector, they do not suffer so much, currently at least, that it would signal some kind of extremely negative developments in the coming months. But certainly companies have been starting to downscale their plans and in a way postponing to some extent their investments, just in case something terrible would happen to Europe. But perhaps it is not postponing things for 10 years, it's more postponing things for a couple of months perhaps. At least so those people working in the banks tell us. And why investments cannot be postponed forever? It comes from the fact that the capacity utilization in industry is quite close to the historic peaks already. So this excess capacity created during the crisis years, when factories were operating at half load, is currently more or less regained. And capacity utilization, which you can see on the right-hand scale, usually never meets 100%. There is always some kind of excess capacity in the industry available. I think for the Euro average, it's something like 70%, a historic maximum, or the levels which usually reflect to the peaks in economic cycle. In Estonia, around 80% has been so far the maximum. But still, if you want to extend capacity at this point of time, you certainly need additional investments. And if you look at Estonia and the situation in Europe in general, then it is quite generous in terms of adding capacity to your factories or industries or services sector, because interest rates are still quite low, mainly because of the extremely low base interest, and the labor, even in a country like Estonia, is quite available yet, which may not be the case in the peak of the cycle. So in principle, we have seen enterprises having different strategies in the previous episodes of economic cycle, and those who start their investments earlier, they usually gain in terms of lower capital costs and in terms of higher productivity, especially in the area of labor. Whereas companies who follow the leaders with time lag sometimes of 2 years, they do the opposite. They usually pay higher interest rates and hire people with higher wages and lower productivity. So in this extent, if you have been making mistakes in the previous cycle and currently still suffering because of those mistakes, then you do not have many options. But especially those industries who extend their capacity in cooperation with their foreign affiliates, those have quite good possibilities nowadays to increase. And we have seen also in some ways some evidence that it is taking place. If you look at the dynamics of unemployment or employment, so basically Estonia is a typical example of the real estate boom. It is not very visible from this chart. You need to make quite precise calculations, but if you look at those green bars there, those are construction workers. I can tell you that in Estonia, the amount of construction workers during the construction boom doubled. So the amount of people working in construction doubled in a matter of something like 2 or 3 years. Fortunately or unfortunately, the number of people trained as construction workers was not so high as an increase. So many people who didn't know anything about construction started to act as construction workers. They built many houses which were quite ugly. You can see one of those houses in the neighborhood of the Bank of Estonia. This is the shopping center Solaris, which initially was built. The idea was to build it as a concert hall. In some deep ends of this house there is some kind of cinema, I've heard. But as an example of this construction boom, the ceiling of this cinema hall fell down just a couple of hours before the opening. Fortunately, nobody was hurt, but it will reflect just the fact that the productivity in construction or the quality of construction was extremely bad. And I would say that we waited forward construction bust to happen. Unfortunately, this house was built just during the very last year of the peak. So if this bubble would have burst earlier, there would be a nice area of park or whatever, and you could enjoy the view to Bank of Estonia's nice building from the site, which is not possible now. But in principle, why I'm telling this is exactly the story. And during the fall, this is exactly the story of Nordic countries in their real estate boom and bust in early 90s. In Finland and Sweden, especially in Finland, there was a construction boom in early 90s. And after the bust, basically 50%, half of the construction workers lost their jobs. And Finns told us this story in something like 2009 or 8. We didn't believe it. It is not possible that you almost overnight half of the construction workers will lose their jobs, and in real estate prices can even adjust by the factor of 2. So basically 50% of fall in real estate prices was the case of early 90s in Scandinavia, in some areas, not necessarily as an overall average decrease, but in some business related spaces there was a significant correction after the boom. And it was exactly what happened in Estonia. So in principle, history tends to repeat itself. And if you look at the recovery, then certainly also construction sector has gained to some extent. So some former construction workers or people working in construction have been able to restore their employment in this sector, but it's mainly the recovery comes from the industry, and especially from this exporting part of the industry. So why it's not tragedy if you have all of a sudden 2 times more construction workers and then almost the original figure before the boom. I would say that those people are most likely quite mobile again. Whenever some area of industry starts to recover and needs low-skilled people, then those people are available. So in principle it's not as bad as all of a sudden you would have 2 times less central bankers needed, because those people usually are quite arrogant and do not start to work in the industry or whatever, at least as low-skilled people. Whereas those people are quite mobile, not only across sectors but also across Europe. So we have seen that in Estonia the motivation to leave Estonia is much higher for low-skilled people, because the gain, the absolute gain in terms of salaries is much more significant and perhaps motivating for those people who have been unsuccessfully searching for a job for the last 2 years. Whereas for high-skilled people, their life is already quite tolerable in the range of monthly salary starting above the 1,200 euros level or whatever it is. The country average is still somewhat lower, but in many high-skilled areas the sectoral average is quite affordable already now, which enables you to live a decent life already in Estonia, not leaving there. And those people who live in the high-skilled sectors, they tend to return after a couple of years, whereas people who have left Estonia in the low-skilled area, they tend to preserve their location in Europe, because for them